Hello, AGU. My name is Lucky Tran, and I am the Managing Director for March for Science, and I'm the Director of Science Communications for Columbia University. Firstly, how's everyone doing today? I hope you're well, hope you're staying healthy, hope you're keeping your communities healthy. It's such a difficult time in the world, so we really need to pull together to get through this right now. I'm here today to talk to you about how change happens, the role of activism and movements in advancing science policy and social justice. And wow, we've had such a difficult 4 years, haven't we? We've been through a lot as a scientific community. And I'm here to talk to you today about how we've responded as a community and where our future in terms of science policy and activism lies. So, when I say that we've been through a lot as a science community over the last 4 years, what do I mean? Well, our friends at Columbia Law School and the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund have been tracking all of the different attacks on science at the federal and state level over the last 4 years. And yeah, they've found a whole bunch. They've found almost 500 different separate attacks on science at both state and federal level. And when we talk about attacks on science, what do we mean? Well, we mean attacks all over the shop. We've had everything from government censorship, that's things like taking down climate and public health words from federal agency websites, from personnel changes, which mean that lifelong servants in government have been removed in place of industry insiders, so we've lost a lot of expertise in government, and to things like budget cuts, of course, where we're really restricted in doing good science that serves the public because our funding has been cut. So yeah, we've been through a lot, right? But I really don't want to dwell on all this in this talk because this talk is about how we've responded, how the scientific community has acted in response to being under attack and put under pressure by the federal government. And you know where one of the first responses started? It was actually right here at AGU. It was at the 2016 event in San Francisco, and we actually held a rally right outside the premises. It was an amazing sight with hundreds of scientists standing up and talking and galvanizing all of the people assembled there, activists, supporters of science, and other scientists who were here attending AGU. It was incredible, and it was really the first time the press sort of caught on that something was happening within the scientific movement, that things were changing and we were going to start speaking up from right now. A few months later in Boston, we held an even bigger rally at the AAAS conference. This time, thousands of people gathered, and you could sense something huge was building. And then in early 2017, something huge happened. The Trump administration started removing data on climate change from federal agency websites. There was a spectacular uproar from the scientific community. This led to the March for Science, which became the largest day of science advocacy ever. It was held on Earth Day in 2017, and there was a huge event in DC with hundreds of thousands of people rallying and marching with lab coats and pro-science signs all over the mall. And we were joined by over 1.5 million people who marched in over 650 locations all around the world. And yes, all around the world, on all 7 continents, from the top of Mount Everest to the bottom of the ocean. We even had marches at the North and South Pole. It was an incredible historical event that brought attention to something that really wasn't a huge public issue previously, and that is how the government should work with scientists and how science should be the center of all public policy. Okay, so those numbers were amazing, and those scenes were really incredible, right? But did those protests really do anything? I mean, were they effective? Now, before we can answer that, we really need to revise. I mean, what's a protest anyway? You know, beyond the signs and the marching and the chanting. Well, I think that protests are all about shifting power, especially in the face of injustice. But wait a minute, doesn't that mean that these protests were ineffective? I mean, there's been so many attacks on science, right? You know, it's funny, even though so many people marched, surveys showed that the majority of participants didn't think that it would lead to changes in public policy. Okay, so here's the thing. There's a big pervasive myth with protests, right? People often think that if you make them big, they will bring about change because politicians will look out the window and say, gee, that's a lot of people. I'd better pass that bill now. But actually, that rarely happens. But even though that rarely happens, that doesn't mean that protests don't lead to change. You just gotta look deeper. And if you look beyond the surface, you'll find many ways that protests change things. Here are 3 big ones. First is direct action. And what we mean by that is you directly get in the way of something that is an injustice. So you chain yourself to a pipeline or you go on strike and you directly force power to change through your actions. The second big way is to change the narrative. You can't make change without people talking about it, without ideas getting in the public consciousness. And so changing the narrative is really important. And the third big way that often people discount is that you create an army of activists. Getting people to a huge event doesn't mean things will change there straight away, but they'll send people in lots of different directions, get them more amplified, more excited. They know that they're not alone. And then by working together, you can really create long-term change. So in terms of the science advocacy movement, I'd really like to focus on those last two items. And I think over the last 4 years, in terms of narrative change, a lot has happened. I mean, I used to literally sit in front of debates and count how many times they would mention science, and it would be often never, or sometimes once or twice if we were lucky. Now, if you fast forward to the 2020 election, you quickly find that most of the debates were centered around science issues. Biden and Trump were talking about coronavirus and climate change. These were brought up regularly. And when you survey the voters in the last election, you'll find that science issues came among the top issues that people really cared about. And you know what? Science advocates everywhere even changed the scientific community itself when it comes to narrative. By the time election rolled around, journals like Nature and Science and Scientific American and the New England Journal of Medicine took a really unprecedented step, which was endorsing a presidential candidate. In addition to narrative change, all of the activity at the start of 2017 lasted so much longer. And the reason for that was that it also created so many new activists and advocates for science. When we did surveys of the 2017 march, we found something amazing. Around 90% of the people who participated said that it was their first science advocacy event ever. And when we looked further and asked them, were they doing more stuff after the march? Nearly all participants said they were. Around 97% were talking with friends and family about science advocacy. Around 83% were contacting government officials. Around the same number were attending more protests in all sorts of issues. And around the same number again donated money to political campaigns and science advocacy orgs. And the amazing thing about all of this was that it grew to even larger, more long-lasting actions. So many new activists then went on to organize other protests in all sorts of issue areas. They started their own nonprofits around science advocacy and education. They switched their whole careers to do more science communication and to go into science policy. And guess what? Scientists even ran for office. And as momentum was building through narrative change and creating new activists for the movement, we started to get some wins. Even with everything happening, with all the tax on science, we got some wins. Things like defeating the graduate student tax, pressuring political appointees like Scott Pruitt at federal agencies, even winning some environmental protections at national parks. And all through this, even though the White House continually tried to defund science, what really happened in Congress was that science funding was often increased. And that's the work of amazing advocacy throughout these tough times. And slowly but surely, change happened in the electoral arena too. In the 2018 midterms, a record number of scientists ran and won office. And then in the recent presidential election, guess what? We actually elected a president who made science a top issue of their platform. Who would have thought it? Now, I know this is great, but okay, I know what you're thinking. I know you're thinking, all of these wins are incredible, but aren't you concerned? Aren't you worried that all of this activism has polarized science? Isn't that a bad thing to happen long term? Well, I think that's another big myth with science and activism. When the Pew Research Center surveyed the public and asked them what jobs they trust most, scientists actually came out on top. The bottom? Well, that's elected officials. But that's another story. It's important to know that, yeah, there are distrusts with the public in terms of issues like climate and the coronavirus pandemic. But a lot of that really isn't because scientists are becoming active. A lot of that is because politicians are polarizing and attacking science itself. Actually, if you want to critique something about science and activism, I think it's this. It's that we are not fighting hard enough with and for oppressed, marginalized, and frontline communities. We maintain broken systems in academia of entrenched patriarchy and white supremacy and many other forms of bigotry. That shows up in our advocacy, and it can make our advocacy ineffective. Shout out to amazing movements like 500 Women Scientists and Black in STEM who are doing incredible work on this. More on this, please, science community. In fact, in many ways, we need to talk less about science advocacy and more about science justice. We face multiple crises: coronavirus, climate change, and systemic racism. All of these are huge issues which have connections to science, and they don't affect everyone equally. Look, I'm hearing that y'all are breathing a sigh of relief from the election result and can't wait to get things back to normal. Well, normal isn't good enough. Normal has led to great harm. Electing a president who listens to science is not good enough. As we move into new presidency, we can't slow down. If anything, we need to ramp this up. We need to be organizing around more than simply advocacy. We need to be organizing for science justice. And with that note, I'm going to end this talk. Thank you so much for watching. I'm going to leave you with a bunch of advocacy tips. I won't go too much in the weeds because I think you should go away and then should come back to our panel so that we can discuss them. You can hit pause if you need to. And then join us on Tuesday, December 15th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time for our panel, Beyond 2020, The Future of Federal Science in an Evolving Era. Thank you so much to Gretchen Goldman from Union of Concerned Scientists for inviting me to give this talk and to join that panel. And please connect with me via Twitter or via email. I would love to talk about science advocacy and get you involved because right now we have so much work to do and we need everyone more than ever. Thank you, AGU. Please stay safe and take care. Bye.